Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're just going to give people a little bit of time to get into the session before we get going. Thank you all very much for joining us for today's webinar. It is called Should PR Cancel or Counsel? It's a great line. I'd like to know who came up with it because I think we may have to steal that over here at Provoke Media. It's one that can be applied to many sessions. But this, of course, is a discussion about the PR industry and fossil fuel brands. In particular, we're going to talk about the Clean Creatives Pledge, which calls on agencies to decline future contracts with the fossil fuel industry, and it calls on clients to decline work with agencies that retain fossil fuel industry clients. So far, more than 1,000 creatives and 400 agencies have signed the pledge. And of course, we're going to talk about this pledge coming to Asia Pacific, where Vero has become the first Southeast Asian agency to sign the pledge. This session is being conducted by the PRCA Asia Pacific in conjunction with Clean Creatives, with Provoke Media and Vero. And it comes as PR industry work for fossil fuels companies is attracting plenty of attention. Last week at the General Assembly, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres criticized PR agencies for raking in billions to shield the fossil fuel industry from scrutiny, just as they did for the tobacco industry decades before. Lobbyists and spin doctors have spewed harmful misinformation, he said. So that was a good look for the PR industry. The week before that, US federal legislators ramped up their probe into PR firms' relationships with big oil companies through a congressional hearing that investigated the industry's role in spreading deceptive information. And Clean Creatives, of course, has launched a poster campaign in New York calling out PR firms, including Edelman, Weber Shandwick, and Ogilvy to pick a side. So there is a lot going on. This is really, I suspect this is kind of the culmination in some respects of a lot of the work Clean Creatives has been doing over the past couple of years. I'm going to ask a few questions during this session. Please feel free, all of you that have joined. We've got a good turnout so far. Please feel free to ask questions. Please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. It's easier for me to keep track of. And we'll try to get as many answered as possible. Before we do that, let me introduce the panel quickly. We have Doug, who's Executive Director of Clean Creatives. We have Rafael Lashkar, who's the Chief Operating Officer at Vero. Anish Daryani, who's the Founder and President Director at MNC Saatchi in Indonesia. We have Vuquan Masay Nguyen, who's the VP of Culture and Brand at Vero. And we've got Rachel Chang, who's the divestment organizer for Students for a Fossil-Free Future, S4F. Thank you all for joining today's session. Duncan, if you wouldn't mind, I'll start with you. Tell us a little bit more about Clean Creatives, how it came into being, what it is looking to accomplish, and specifically what it's looking to accomplish in Asia Pacific.
Thank you very much, Arun, and thank you very much to the PRCA, to Anish at MNC Saatchi, Rachel, and the Vero team. It's really great to be part of this conversation. Clean Creatives was started, based on my experience as a campaigner for climate action. I worked at doing communications for climate NGOs, and my experience of that was basically every time we would try to do something good, there'd be a very effective PR campaign to do something bad. And that played a really big role in limiting our ability to, do things like make the Paris Climate Agreement stronger, to advance climate legislation in the United States, which is mostly where I've worked. And we began this project because we realized that we think that, in particular with young people in the creative and communications industry, their values are not in step with the values of fossil fuel companies. That there are many thousands of employees who play a vital role in growing this industry, and that they see their future as being on the line with climate action. And that we think if we brought those people together to have a conversation about the reality of the role that fossil fuels play in climate change, that we would be able to move the PR industry towards committing to work for climate action instead of against it. And so the big picture of sort of why we think this is important is somewhere between 75 and 90% of how, depending on how you account, of global carbon pollution that causes climate change comes from fossil fuels. At the same time, every year there are 7 million people who die prematurely as a result of pollution from fossil fuels. And every single year, fossil fuel companies, from big oil, coal companies, gas companies, they tell investors, they tell bankers, they tell regulators that they're going to dig up and burn more fossil fuels. They've announced those as their business plans. And we think that that is not a responsible business practice, and that essentially PR agencies and advertising agencies should not align themselves with companies that are responsible for the climate emergency. This has particular relevance in the Asia Pacific region for two really big reasons in my mind. One is that it's an area with a lot of growing fossil fuel consumption right now. Indonesia is the world's largest coal exporter. China is the world's biggest coal consumer country-wise, and there's an enormous amount of capital flowing in and out of the region to support fossil fuel development. And at the same time, it's one of the most climate vulnerable parts of the world. Jakarta is hugely vulnerable. It's one of the most climate vulnerable big cities anywhere on the planet that could result in the displacement of tens of millions of people. Right now, there are 12 million children in Bangladesh who are displaced for one reason or another because of flooding, and all these impacts are going to get worse. So that is essentially the thing that we are trying to stop, and we think that the companies that we're talking about are responsible for those impacts, and that it's not the right thing to do to work with them. And ultimately, our take is that we think this is the most effective way to impact the business plans of fossil fuel companies. That when you take a step that is to essentially limit their access to talent, to creativity, until their business plans align with science and align with the things that scientists are asking us to do, they're more likely to align their business plans with those priorities. So that's our approach to this issue, and I'm really excited for the dialogue, and I'll hand it back to you, Arun.
Thanks, Duncan. Rachel, if you don't mind, I'd like to come to you next, mainly because I think it would be really interesting to hear the perspective that you represent, a coalition of students from Singaporean universities, I believe, that are calling on companies to kind of ensure a fossil-free future. How do you feel about the Clean Creatives campaign coming to Asia from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Arun, and thanks, Duncan, for the introduction. So essentially, we are a student coalition with them calling on our universities to end their current partnerships with the industry and to also divest their investments in the fossil fuel industry. I think that the Clean Creatives campaign has been gaining traction in North America and Australia. The role of the PR industry in those regions have been under increasing scrutiny, and I think we are glad to see this emerging in Asia, be it a very different political and economic climate, but hopefully bringing about greater accountability measures when it comes to environmental claims. As ESG and the field is growing, I believe we can be a leader in making sure that it's done well and done right. Yeah.
Thanks, Rachel. So I can come to Vero next. Obviously, Vero has signed the pledge. So Raphael and Vuquan, I mean, either or both of you, however you wish to handle these questions. Why do you think agencies should sign this pledge, and how difficult was it for Vero? Did you have to give up any existing business, for example?
Thank you, Arun. Perhaps I can take the answer, and Vuquan, feel free to jump in. So I think, yeah, perhaps I should highlight that we were fortunate enough to be able to take the pledge, right? We're an independent agency, we're in growing economies, we're employee owned, we could really make that decision fairly seamlessly. We're not overly dependent, or we were not overly dependent on fossil fuel budgets. We receive opportunities, and we still do, actually, even after taking that pledge, from fossil fuel brands, but it was not a difficult business decision to decide to not engage with them anymore. As a matter of fact, we were already not engaging with those companies. We were not taking in those briefs. So from our perspective, I think, yeah, we took the pledge because we could, right? And we did that because we see it as a way to put the agency on a track towards a more sustainable corporate practice in Southeast Asia. We know how important it is for the region. Duncan talked about the urgency. I live in Ho Chi Minh City. The city is born to be underwater by 2030 with the rising levels of the sea. And so we know how important in that it is. And what we're also seeing, I think it's something that also ties to our role as an employer, is that there's also a growing expectation from people in Southeast Asia to veer away from fossil fuel. There are studies that show that more than ever today, inhabitants of Southeast Asia, and not only people in Singapore, but people all across the region, understand that there needs to be a shift away from fossil fuel. And so in terms of why we thought that taking that pledge was important, we think it's the best way today to ensure that we're on the right side of that agenda, and that the work that we do doesn't contribute to maintaining a status quo that is affecting the planet and that is going against, I think, just a sustainability agenda tackling climate change. And so that's how we went about it. And it's making it also clear about how we want to engage with companies in general, which, you know, what I find very compelling with the Clean Creative Pledge and the campaign that Duncan has built is that it's very straightforward. It's simple, right? And it's a pledge, so it ties to people willingness to take it and to execute it. But what it means and how it's executed on a daily basis is very straightforward. And for that, I think it's very compelling. Yeah.
And what was the response like within Vero, the response from your staff? Were there any specific questions that came up from them? I'm curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, so I think it was twofold. So first, we had some account owners. Of course, we looked at our brand engagements just before doing it, and so we looked at potential clients or brands that we would have to let go, and we had to do some due diligence to really understand how they would connect with that pledge. So we did have those conversations with our staff. We're a very horizontal structure. People get to choose in general who they work with and who they don't work with. So obviously, there was a lot of discussions around, you know, how comfortable and happy they would be to let go of some of those clients. And in general, in the vast majority, people understood why that would be important. On the other end, when we talk with potential new employees, people seeking, considering doing a career at Vero, it's always something that comes up and that they find interesting. And yeah, the second aspect is just we know and we see discussing with our people that it's something that is important to them, and they see it again. What I find very compelling with the pledge is that they understand how it takes place within the business. It's very straightforward, and it really talks for the strategy of our business in Southeast Asia in a way that is understandable and compelling. And so in general, the reaction has been very positive.
Okay, good. Anish, let me come to you next. How do you see this situation in terms of agencies taking the pledge? Is it as easy as signing up, or do you think there are more issues involved here?
Okay, so let me tell you guys a few things about MNC Saatchi and myself. Okay, so MNC Saatchi early in the year set up a business called MNC Saatchi Life, which is basically aimed at enabling clients towards achieving sustainable goals on the one hand, and it also brands the agency internally towards a net zero commitment, which we want to achieve over the next 3 years, right? So that's at a group level. At a local level, I'm really proud that I'm one of the few agencies in Southeast Asia that's actually won a Cannes Lion in the Sustainable Development Goals space. And we do a lot of work proactively and pro bono when it comes to sustainability. So I'm personally a member of the Indonesia India Foundation, and we've done campaigns which have got 1 million volunteers into the streets, not to party or have fun, but to, you know, roll up their sleeves and pick up trash from the streets, from the rivers, from the hills and mountains of the country, right? We've stopped we've done campaigns that help prevent child marriage in Indonesia, which is another aspect of a sustainable social structure. And we've done voluntary work for the Wood Writers and Readers Festival to promote adoption of reading so that people are more aware of social issues and how they should do something about it. So that's my background and that's where I come from. But when it comes to the idea of supporting a cause where agencies should stop supporting brands that have their origins in fossil fuels, I do beg to differ. The reason being that we're not really solving anything by signing this pledge, by saying that agencies should stop working with fossil fuel brands, because primarily, if you look at it, we are completely at the bottom of the chain of the value system, right? If we direct the same energies towards asking engineering and mining companies to stop searching for sources of fossil fuels going forward, we'd be directing our energies in a way where the problem starts, right, rather than where the problem ends. Largely, I guess, as professionals, we owe it to our clients to solve problems when they come to us. It's like saying that doctors shouldn't be treating professionals who come from fossil fuel industry, or lawyers should take up their cases because they shouldn't be supported. I think we live in more and more in an inclusive environment, and this is an aspect of inclusion that we also need to acknowledge and accept. I'm really glad that there is a Clean Creatives pledge. I'm really glad that someone's doing something about it. But I do believe that there are better ways of approaching the problem. And maybe I'll talk about it in more detail when you have more questions to ask, because I have some I was published recently in Campaign Asia talking about some of these ideas that agencies could intervene in and make clients more responsible in terms of what they're doing. But yeah, that would be my perspective as an individual and as an industry professional on your question.
Great, thanks, Anish. Yeah, we'll definitely come back to you to get your views on other ways of tackling the problem. But Duncan, let me come to you first here, perhaps to respond to that. Anish's point that the industry, agencies shouldn't necessarily be shunning fossil fuel companies, and partly because they are not quite as influential as perhaps we'd like to think they are, but also because of this notion that I think everyone deserves representation. Be curious to hear your response.
Yeah, I think our basic position is that companies that are announcing to investors and the public that they want to destroy the one planet that supports life don't deserve representation. I mean, there's a line that should be drawn when you're dealing with an issue of this level of gravity, that it is simply a different case from other issues where, there might be other, different boundaries you can draw. Agencies make decisions every single day about what they're going to pitch for and what they're not. And we're just encouraging agencies to add this to their criteria because it is at a level of urgency and literal emergency that I think makes it sort of a different kind of case. I think you kind of have to figure out where you have the most leverage, and if it's a situation where you're kind of at the end of the food chain, as so to speak, and maybe the best thing to say is like, okay, if I can't make any ask for you to change, like maybe, but you're still asking for being willing to pay however much for my services, perhaps the leverage I have is just to walk away and to say that this is just not something I'm going to offer until you can sort of share with us that you have a different plan that's not going to support the destruction of tens of millions of lives. So I'm very sympathetic to, and I really love this campaign because I've connected with so many incredibly talented people. And I do believe that this is an industry full of people who can really change the world for the better. And I think you do that by by developing really clear boundaries. And I think this is the right boundary to draw, essentially. So that's my thought on the matter. I'm very, I love these dialogues because I always think that we can find common ground on how to move this forward.
Thanks, Duncan. Anish, I'll come back to you in a second. I'm curious to get Vero's view on one of your points as well. This idea that companies are all deserving of representation. I mean, I think when you talk about doctors and lawyers, they are required by law to represent clients. Doctors take an oath, and lawyers, also everyone is guaranteed legal counsel. That doesn't really apply to the PR industry, at least. So Raphael and Vucon, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. Do you, as an agency, do you feel that it's okay for you to exclude certain clients from representation? And how do you arrive at that kind of decision?
Yeah, perhaps I can. Oh, go ahead, Vucon.
All right. Thanks, Raf. I'll just start with one point where we just need to be conscious in our industry, in PR and comms, that we are influential because the data shows it. The budgets that fossil fuel companies put into our practices is huge. It's literal billions of dollars. That's influence. Taking that money is influence, or refusing to take that money is influence. So I think on that end, we do have more impact on the question and on how to change things than we can be led to believe. So that's one element. And the second element is the people who work for us and with us are professionals, but also citizens. And they're moving towards this, I think, belief that and awareness that there's an emergency at hand. So the reason we moved forward with this pledge is that we believe that there's a need, an urgent need corresponding to the climate emergency to raise awareness in the region so that young professionals, older professionals, I'm not excluding any class of age, can actually voice their concern and impact how we as an industry operate in relationship to fossil fuel industries.
Yeah, I think I can add a few points there. And so first, Anish, I do agree with you on some of what you said. Indeed, there are a lot more and a lot of other things that can be done to address that issue. And with that, I completely align with you. What I do believe, though, is that taking the pledge, or at least looking at who you engage with, is a core part of that process. So with regards to whether anyone deserves due counsel in PR, I think it really depends on what the brief is, right? If you're a doctor and, well, doctor by law, you have, I don't know if it's the right example because by law you'll have to address it, but if someone comes to you and says, I'm sick and you need to, well, again, maybe we don't use the doctor metaphor, but what I would say is, what is, because obviously you're gonna heal the guy. So what is the brief when fossil fuel companies come to PR agencies? What's the agenda really, right? And unfortunately, and this is, I think, what brought us also to consider that engagement as being such a clear-cut engagement. Unfortunately, the brief is very rarely, if ever, help us change our business practices so that we can be more sustainable. The brief is, in the subtext, help us maintain a reputation and an influence on policymakers for long enough so that we can maximize profits until we disappear. Because unfortunately for them, and this is where the world is going, fossil fuel will born to disappear from the role it's playing, at least today, in the economies. And numbers prove that. Think it's a report from Influence Map. It's an NGO based in the UK, I think, that looks at just monitoring the climate agenda globally. And what they've shown is that 60% of communications budget of fossil fuel companies go into sustainability rhetorics, right? Tied to positioning them and detailing their actions that are being done on a sustainable standpoint, or at least what they brand as such. And that's only, so that's 60% going in comms and 12% of their investments going into actual sustainable energy production, R&D, and distribution, right? So there's a huge dichotomy between the amount of time that is spent from fossil fuel cos talking and branding their overall operations as being, good corporate actors in the sustainable agenda, vs the amount of resources that is put on the ground to ensure that they actually become sustainable corporate actors in the climate agenda. So I think this is a very straightforward way of looking at what is the brief. Is the brief about protecting a reputation, or is the brief about initiating change in an organization, right? And unfortunately, for the planet, it seems like it's more of the latter than the former than the latter. Sorry.
Yeah, Raphael, I think that's a really interesting point, and it's one that kind of speaks to one of the central issues here, which is that if you look at the public relations industry in general, it wouldn't be much of an industry if it only worked with clients who had unblemished reputations. The whole idea behind public relations is to work with companies to try and improve their behavior, and to try to do that in line with the expectations of various stakeholder groups. But of course, I think the issue here, perhaps, is what sometimes we kind of describe it as this kind of 5% question. What you often hear from PR firms is they are working on the 5% of an energy company's business that is devoted to net zero, that is devoted to renewables. That's the good stuff. But the question is that providing cover for the other 95%? And in that case, is it actually undermining the supposed positive work that the agency is doing? So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, Duncan, on that particular point. And then I'll come back to you, Anish, and then over to you, Rachel, as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting when you see a lot of fossil fuel advertisements in public relations. Sometimes it often seems like they're not quite selling anything in particular. You see like Aramco at F1 races or something like that. It's sort of the general idea of sustainability. They're not saying, we're really excited for you to buy more oil, gasoline is great. It's like energy. It's at this level of concepts and feelings. It's very abstract from their business practices. And it's not like, a Burger King advertisement or a PR campaign where it's like, we would like you to buy hamburgers. And the reason that is the case is because most of the ultimate purpose of these campaigns is to limit the political room for governments to regulate fossil fuel production and consumption. The target is influential decision makers, so that there's not as much room for climate action. So generally speaking, that rides on reputation, and the reputation of your companies being responsible or irresponsible has a great deal to do with whether or not governments nationally, internationally are willing to regulate your business. So in my opinion, and I think this is borne out by, as Vuquan pointed out, how and why this money is spent, it's often spent in sync with discussions about global climate action. It's in sync with discussions of when legislation is being considered. That's when most of this activity begins to occur. And to me, that's a pattern that suggests that it's an effort to disrupt the really meaningful steps we need to take by governments to stop the climate emergency. So that's my takeaway from that 5% problem, is that there's a very specific agenda in mind, and that agenda can be quite harmful to the global action that we need to take.
Thanks, Duncan. Anish, over to you. Curious to hear your response to some of the points
Sure.
that have been raised.
Sure. So I think by going against clients or brands that have their origins in fossil fuels, we are sort of closing eyes in terms of the opportunities that lie in working with them. We're making them the cause of the problem rather than a part of the solution. And there's a big opportunity in making them a part of the solution. You spoke about hamburgers, Duncan. Livestock. I mean, for all the meat that we love to eat, right? All the beef, all our, steaks and whatnot, are the largest contributor to methane that comes from livestock. Is actually probably contributes 3 times more. I don't have stats. I wish I had them ready on my fingertips. I don't. But they contribute 3 times more, greenhouse gases than the carbon dioxide and monoxide coming up from automobiles and vehicles and the planes, right? So that's one perspective. Okay. So by that by that logic, clean creators should work at asking everyone to go vegan as well, and not just target fossil fuel brands, because they're perhaps a bigger contributor to the problem in a way. Okay. The second aspect is probably clean creators should look at behavior change in a way that, rather than working against the brand, work with the people, saying that, maybe you should carpool more often, maybe you shouldn't take flights when you don't need to, or maybe you should bike your way to work and there are healthy advantages to it or whatnot. So that's another way of looking at it. But I think where we can really make a difference, and I've given you my background, and I genuinely care about sustainability, and I do a lot of work pro bono to support such initiatives, is that, can we bring in governments, can we bring in regulators, and work with them and the fossil fuel manufacturing companies to devote more of their time and resources and budgets towards having a net zero carbon output, because a lot of the companies are already doing that, but maybe some of them, and not all of them, because I work with some companies who actually take their sustainability efforts very responsibly. But there are certain companies that probably do it as lip service, and then make them accountable for what they're doing. That's what Greenpeace is doing in many ways, taking on corporates that perhaps claim to be doing good for the planet, but it's all an eyewash. And yes, make them accountable, make them deliver on their promises, and we must do that. But then one way to do that is, of course, to work with authorities, work with governments, work with regulators, and make it mandatory for these companies to have their carbon scores on their communications, on their advertising, on their packaging. Like tobacco has details about how it's injurious to health. So maybe have a score which says this is how much harm we cause to the planet, and let the consumers decide whether that's a brand for them. Are they doing enough to offset their carbon footprint, or going the way, a lot of us feel the pain that the planet's going through. We're all worried about bringing kids into the world, because we don't know if we can give them a safe enough future. And so everybody will definitely care in terms of buying into brands that genuinely are doing enough. And the reason why that care comes into being is that we are, as consumers, as users, as much as a part of the problem as the creators, because we're the ones who consume, right? We're not going to stop driving our cars or sitting on planes or our bikes or whatever starting today. And even if we had options like EV, how do electronic vehicles work? The dark side of how EV batteries are made and the waste they create is another problem in itself. And then we're going to use fossil fuel-based energy to recharge our EV batteries, not sustainable energy to recharge our EV batteries. So that again becomes another loophole and a debate in itself. So if Clean Creators really wants to make a huge impact by garnering the support that you're getting, and even influence professionals like me to come on board and lend my voice, the only way I want to come on board is when you start solving the problem at its root and not just at the surface.
Thanks, great. So Duncan, I want to come to you because I think you probably want to respond to a couple of things there, and then Rachel, I'll definitely come to you after that. So Duncan, I think the points raised by Anish, your clean creatives, I think you should be perhaps tackling more, not doing enough, and maybe trying to solve lots of these problems, and in particular focusing on the behavior of people and the choices that they make.
Yeah, so I'm a vegan. I don't eat meat. I haven't for many years, and I still do this work because I really do see the fossil fuel economy as being at the center of the climate problem. You know, I think people should eat less meat. It does real damage to the world around you. I think it's a good decision. So,
Right.
but you know, the scientific reality, if you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is that agriculture in general, not just meat, you know, is about 12% of global carbon emissions, and that includes methane. So the reality is that it's actually a relatively small part of the climate puzzle. It's one that we do have a lot of personal influence on because, you know, you're kind of picking up the carbon yourself, and it's actually relatively easy to change, and we could get that whole discussion, but there's obviously a lot of questions involved in that. And, you know, the choices we have, it's actually a very exciting time where like we do have the option for where clean energy is the cheapest source of energy in the world. You can get it from the sun. And, you know, the question is sort of like the new economy and the impact that's going to have on the planet is really significant. And it's going to involve some like very difficult choices. You know, there's a big electric vehicle manufacturing factory that just moved to my hometown in Texas. And I can tell you it's having an impact on our local economy and environment. But ultimately, when we build that clean energy economy, it's going to have quite literally 1/100th of an impact on the planet that digging up and burning coal, oil, and gas has every single day. And there's just so many more opportunities for reuse, for recycle, for local economies that I think are really great and will work. And just the last thing I wanted to say is, you know, about the Clean Creatives Pledge itself is we're trying to be as specific as we can about the kinds of companies that we want agencies to avoid work with. And those are companies that are spending more than half of their existing budget on fossil fuel expansion or receiving more than half of their profits from fossil fuel, burning fossil fuels if you're a utility or industry organizations that represent them. And so if you're a company like Ørsted in Europe, and you used to own a bunch of coal plants, but you shut them down, you're great. Like you have passed the test, and there are agencies that have signed the pledge that have Ørsted as a client. And 5 years ago, Ørsted would have been excluded by the pledge, but now they're okay. So really what we're asking is for agencies to draw a very firm line about companies putting their money where their mouth is, that their statements align with their budgets. And it's not the situation you have with a company like Shell, where one of the first things you see on Shell's website is talking about their net zero commitment. But last week or the week before last, there are statements that were released from their emails declaring in black and white that they are not going to invest in net zero solutions for another 10 to 20 years. It's just not responsible to be making that claim on a website today when it's not part of your business plan for another 2 decades. So that's the line that we want to draw. It's not that, you know, we never want you to work with Shell. It's that when Shell gets their act together and that net zero plan is today and not 2 decades in the future, that's when we think that a company should engage. So, but I'll pass to Rachel. I know she hasn't had a chance to check in yet.
Yeah, Rachel, I'm really keen to hear your perspective here, given the coalition that you represent. I mean, how important is this kind of a pledge in terms of companies' appeal as an employer, perhaps, but even also from your perspective as a consumer? You know, how important is it for you and for your coalition to be working for companies, for example, that are not involved in fossil fuels at all?
Thanks, Duncan, and thanks, Arun. I think I'm going to pick up on a few pieces from previous conversations and try to offer a different perspective. But I think I do agree with Vukan about not undermining the role of creatives and the creative industry in tackling climate change. I think as a young person, I see climate change as really the most significant creative challenge of our lives. You know, good creative work generates attention. and if there's anything that the climate crisis needs, it's attention from the younger generations. And I really wonder if the creative industry recognize that they have the individual and collective power to change things. You know, do we recognize that we are responsible and accountable? I want to pick up on what Anish said quickly, because we get these sentiments a lot. When we released our report, people are saying, you know, do these kids, like, do they bike to school? Do they like, how dare you eat meat? You know, I think what's often missing from this climate discourse is the analysis of power. The concept of a carbon footprint was created by the fossil fuel industry as a distraction from the scale of emissions that they were putting out in our atmosphere. And are we fixated on achieving a form of moral purity where, you know, I'm not going to drive, I'm not going to eat meat, or are we going to be courageous and say that we're going to take every action that we can to move the needle towards taking action against it? I think a different perspective that I can hopefully offer as well is to just be a bit more critical about the role of the PR industry as a responsible stakeholder in historically also perpetuating climate change. I think the PR industry has historically, you know, downplayed the severity of the climate change, promoted industry-favored solutions as preferred courses of action, even to the extent of promoting climate denial and inaction. And the industry itself has been a long overlooked influence in climate policies and politics. And when we think about policies and regulations, they really do not exist in a vacuum. They reflect public attitudes and beliefs that, you know, the PR industry really has a huge power in shaping. Sorry, Anish, I'm just going to finish my point if that's okay. Yeah. When I think about public relations, I think about the word relationship, and it really comes down to trust. A recent study released by EcoBusiness just in early September this year found that while 60% of communications by you know, big oil majors like Chevron and ExxonMobil were green claims, only 12% of their investments are really going to renewables. And so I think that brings up the question of, you know, Anish was asking that, you know, they want to be part of the solution. But as a consumer, when I'm reading, you know, studies like that tells me that it seems to be otherwise, I'm questioning, do they really want to be part of the solution? And do we trust that the industry, the fossil fuel industry, will use the power that they have to change the status quo and to lead the way? And so maybe Anish, if you want to respond before I continue.
Sure.
And,
Sorry.
Anish, just a quick response, because we've also got a number of questions from the floor, and I really don't want this to turn into the world versus Anish. But anyway,
No.
Go ahead, please.
No, I'm completely fine with that. In fact, I really like what Rachel said, that, you know, the fact that the PR industry, the advertising industry has a responsibility, and I'm not shying away from that, right? So when it comes to working with, and we will not be able to fulfill that responsibility if we refuse to work with brands that are, in fact, we need to step in and we need to look them in the eye and tell them that I'm not going to do any more greenwashing for you. I'm not going to create a green sheen that doesn't exist. But I want to work with you towards building a more sustainable, practice, so that we do what's good for the environment, for our kids, for the world, rather than help you paint a picture of something that doesn't exist, rather than help you sugarcoat the reality. And I'm all for that. But we're denying ourselves the opportunity to play that role by intervening and educating the client about the realities and reminding them of the responsibilities if we refuse to work with them. That's all the more reason we should work with them and put up a stance. And if they refuse to listen to them, I'll be the first. Like, if I were in that situation and I gave I was working on a live case where I had something, an opportunity to drive that change, and they refused to listen to me, I would see it as a clash of ideology and I would walk out. I can say that. But I'll never get to do that if I walk out from the beginning saying, hey, I don't want to talk to you because you smell of fuel. Yeah, that way I never get an opportunity to intervene and make a difference. So that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, so very clearly counsel rather than cancel, or at least counsel first, and then maybe cancel later. We have a question, actually, this is one I wanted to ask as well, but very helpfully, Robin Hicks has also asked it. Isn't a big issue here the fact that a lot of agencies are going to be unwilling to stop working for fossil fuel clients because they can make so much more money out of them and charge high fees and keep people employed and all of those reasons, sometimes classed under that kind of economic development. For Vero, I suspect it was a much easier decision because you didn't really have any significant fossil fuel business to give up. But if you're a big agency that's making perhaps upwards of double digits, let's say, percentage of your revenue and profit from fossil fuel, it's a much more difficult conversation. I'm curious to hear the thoughts of the panel on whether it's impossible to persuade agencies to take the pledge given those kinds of circumstances. Yeah, Fuquan, go ahead.
Hi, yes. Thanks, Arun, and thanks, Robin, for this question. I think I'll take it from a cultural perspective. And I think Thibaut in the chat with the questions actually brought part of the answer. The campaign that we're taking right now with Clean Creatives and with fellow professionals who are interested in the question is about education, I think. There is, I think, there is actually research showing that in Asia, the leniency towards climate change emergency, the fact that it's being downplayed in people's environment, in the media landscape, etc., is quite true. And what we're doing right now is to try to reverse that. We want to bring the education on this topic to the professionals in our industry. And when we do that, I believe that then I think professionals do have an impact now on how their employers work. More and more, there's competition for talent. Since COVID, we've all heard about all the cultural issues among many industries, including ours, which is one with high turnover, where people might want to leave, might want to go independent, might want to just quit and move to another life altogether because they're anxious about COVID we had and climate changes things. So education is at the core of what is probably happening now in Asia, and with that, we might get to a point where decision makers, agency side and client side, might be able to have the discussion that actually Anish is mentioning, which is, all right, maybe we should move faster now and we should listen to each other. But as long as our peers, individuals are not yet equipped to voice this and to say, I am committed to not do the work with this industry, or I want to pressure this industry to change now radically because it's urgent. Once we have these people ready to do so, I think the industry is going to shift. It's really something that's happening as I think Rachel mentioned in Australia, in America already, and it's just a matter of time before the Asian markets and our peers are educated to the question and start putting pressure on the industry.
If I can build on that.
Yeah, just a quick point, Raphael, because we have a few more to get through as well. Thank you.
Sure, yes. So I think the question is really about what are the benefits of the cost-benefit approach to that, right? And of taking that pledge. And I agree with Fuquan. There are and there will be benefits on how the workforce looks at the employers, and this should drive, I think, bigger corporate actors, bigger agencies, bigger network agencies to take a stand on the issue. But I also think there should be incentives or benefits when in commercial discussions with other brands as well. We're not today, when we're receiving briefs from large international companies that are not fossil fuel companies, they can be FMCG, technology, and who brand themselves as being very active in the sustainability debate. Those briefs don't account for our position as a supplier and what we're doing, good or bad, in the sustainability agenda. And I think it should become a factor. There should be a benefit in taking that pledge on a commercial perspective. That should be an incentive. I think on the broader level, we know, we know that complete bans actually work, right? Not partial bans, but we know from experience in other industries, in other harmful industries such as the tobacco industry, that when you put on a complete ban on advertising, a complete ban on engaging with brands, even through PR, people stop smoking. And and it does work. And you know, Anish, you were talking about the role of the government. I agree. I think that there should be, and there are, engagement with policymakers so that we can go in a place where we're getting to such drastic decisions that are helping us tackle the issue in a more broad way.
Thanks. So just a quick question here as well from the floor. So this stance in terms of the Clean Creatives Pledge, it applies to working with, a question from Adeline, then it applies to working with the, for example, the sustainability arm of a fossil fuel company that has net zero goals, sustainability initiatives, and actively works towards carbon reduction for their mothership.
Yeah, this is kind of the 5% question that we were discussing earlier, and my take is that the question, what is greenwashing, is complicated, but a large part of it has to do with spending a small sum of money and then advertising it a large amount of. And so that's currently the agenda for those small segments of the company. And you know, there's more egregious and less egregious examples of that. But you know, I would say that until you see the mothership, so to speak, really aligning their broad investment strategy along with climate justice or climate action, even, it's really, I think you have the great potential to be engaging in a misleading campaign by taking on that work. So I think there's a very high risk associated with that. And I mean that not just sort of broadly speaking, it'll be bad. It's like that's actually the kinds of work that's brought up in lawsuits about consumer fraud with these companies. It's the main subject of a lot of legal action by governments and regulators. So I think there's a real risk with taking that on. Yeah.
Another couple of questions from the floor. It's actually, one is to Duncan and one is to Vero and MSC Saatchi. So the first one for you, Duncan. I agree that it's time for agencies to take a stand, use their power, but there will always be agencies interested working with that industry. So how do you, I guess, account for that?
Yeah, this is a good question, and it's one of the first questions we had to sort of ask ourselves when we decided whether this is something worth trying. And yeah, that there will be someone who takes the money. You know, that's I think the reality. I think the question is that the A team or is that the C team? Is that the people who are really the most effective communicators out there? And you know, I know this is true of everybody here who started an agency or you know put themselves forward in this work. It's because you believe you have something unique to contribute. You have unique skills, unique perspective, and you know we think if you hold that true, if you believe that's true, that's the thing you're putting in your pitches. That's the thing you're putting in your deck. And if that's true for you, then you should not be offering that unique contribution that only you can offer to companies that are doing great harm. So yes, it may be that someone takes the money. It's a question of whether those are the most effective, the most prestigious, the recruiting the best talent. We haven't had a chance to talk about Rachel and sort of young people and bringing university students into this conversation. But you know, I think there will be someone, but I think we can limit their access to the most effective talent. Is our perspective.
Okay, and then a question for MSC Saatchi and Vero. Do you assess prospective clients to review whether they have involvement with fossil fuels or unsustainable business practices? Anish, perhaps you'd like to take that one first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, coming from first principles, my beliefs and what the organization believes at a global level, and of course we're concerned. We'd like to know. We probably are of the belief that we should intervene and we should advise and guide and show them the way. We should counsel. And so yeah, we'd obviously do that. And I think come on, I mean, as much as we have a business to run and mouths to feed, we also are global citizens, and we believe that we've got to do what's right. So yeah, I'm not. I can put a pledge out and say I won't greenwash anymore, or I've never done it and I wouldn't ever do it. But I just won't ostracize an industry and say that, for us. So yeah, that would be my stance. And yeah.
Vero, any thoughts on that question? Presumably in line with the pledge, you do now have to review any prospective clients.
Is the question, are we conducting due diligence on new clients to see how they align?
Yeah, in terms of their involvement in fossil fuels and also unsustainable business practices. Yeah, so we do two things. We do conduct the due diligence, but we also ask. We're very outspoken about the fact that we've taken that pledge. It's actually taken us a long time for no reason really to put it out there and put it in our creds and everything, just because I think we got swamped in work like a lot of people happen to be sometimes. But now we do, and whenever there is a new business relationship, we highlight that we've made that pledge, and we also have a conversation with the brand about how they position in that pledge. Question for Rachel, from another Rachel. I see education as a solution which addresses some of the concerns about inertia and the role of power dynamics, which the PR industry has served historically. How can the industry and professionals shape education?
Thanks, Arun, and thanks, Rachel, for the question. I actually shared with Vuquan before this conversation about why I thought S4F would be an important voice in this conversation, because I really think that creative professionals do have a role to play in advocating for more accessible design education. So not just how and what we design and create, but why we design and create. What are the ethos and the theories of change behind, campaigns that are out in the world? And I think dialogues like that are a great start. I hope that more of these dialogues will happen in schools where communication professionals, young communication professionals are trying to decide and have their own views and opinions on where they want to be along the spectrum, where they want to align with, where their values lie and how they plan to take action. I think more broadly, when we talk about education too, it's about the framing of problems. And so going back to my earlier point, I think that when we look at how problems are framed, especially in the context of climate change, we see that powerful institutions tend to frame problems for creators, for designers and creatives to solve in ways that often invisibilizes structural inequality. So I would like to see the industry really push the needle on that in acknowledging the structures that have given rise to the systems of power that have given rise to climate change, really critiquing that, acknowledging that the responsibilities of climate change is not equal, acknowledging that we have a role in exposing that and in educating people on that, and also seeing other social issues as interconnected. And so, Anisha, I would love to, I'm holding you accountable. This is a recording. So I'm gonna see what comes down in a few years. And I think the youth of our time are becoming more environmentally aware and conscious of their individual powers in holding large industries accountable. And I think that different firms are going to speak to different youths differently. I am very grateful for agencies like Vero for taking on bold leadership. And I think there's always going to be space for youth to make their own decisions and stepping into the field and saying that this is where I want to be, that aligns best with my values.
Thanks. Some very good points raised there. A couple of quick questions we were asked at the beginning. Are you only concerned about fuel producing firms when we talk about fossil fuel companies? And what's the position on nuclear energy?
We don't take a position on nuclear energy. It's not really the focus of what we're trying to address here, which we think is a very large, very powerful industry that is spending many billions of dollars to obstruct climate action, which is fossil fuels. And so we think solving that aspect of the energy problem will make it easier to approach a diverse number of solutions, which may or may not involve nuclear in different places. It's complicated. It often involves lots of local questions. So yeah, we don't really take a stance on that one way or the other.
Okay.
Can I make an interesting point when it comes to, so this is more from the developing economy perspective, right? And in countries like Indonesia and in Vietnam, the day-to-day fuel you use is actually subsidized, right? So in many ways, fossil fuel brands aren't actually allowed to advertise because the public sees it as that could have made my fuel that much cheaper, right? And so what the advertising really happens is the value added stuff like, you know, engine oils and lubricants and whatnot. And those are like sort of byproducts, which are anyways going waste, and now you've added value to it, which is again good, because then that keeps helps your car deliver better fuel economy and better mileage, and we'd rather have that than not have it, than have cars that throw out even dirtier air and more carbon monoxide and whatnot. So there's also this thing about, even if they really wanted to advertise as much, or they really can't, because their hands are also tied, given the swings that the cost of fuel's also gone through and stuff. There's a dynamics to that as well. So you got to consider that. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, which is a shame because there's still no questions coming in. I still have questions I wanted to ask. We had a really interesting conversation, but I think it's clear that this is really just the tip of the iceberg. And perhaps it would be useful to have a part 2, maybe even a part 3, because this is a big issue. It's complicated conversation for all of the different points of view that are represented, whether it's agency, whether it's NGO, whether it's students. And indeed, we don't have a client in this conversation. That would be interesting as well. So hopefully this is something we can continue. I'm really sorry that we do have to close the conversation down, because I imagine people have other things to go and do. So if you can join me all in thanking our wonderful panel today, and we will follow up with a story on this session as well that you can read on the Provoke Media website. So thank you all very much, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Love
everyone.
talking to you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Anil.